It's a god-awful small affair to the girl with the mousy hair, but her mummy is yelling no, and her daddy has told her to go, but her friend is nowhere to be seen. Now she walks through her sunken dream to the seat with the clearest view, and she's hooked to the silver screen. But the film is a sad thing for she's lived it 10 times or more. She could spit in the eyes of fools as they ask her to focus on sailors fighting in the dance hall. Oh man, look at those cavemen go. It's the freakiest show. Take a look at the old man beating up the wrong guy. Oh man, wonder if you'll ever know who's in the best-selling show. Is their life on Mars? It's on America's tortured brow that Mickey Mouse has grown up the cow. Now the workers have struck for fame, 'cause Lennon's on sale again. See the mice in their million hordes, from my people to the Norfolk Broads. Rule Britannia is out of bounds, to my mother, my dog and clowns. But the film is a sad thing more, 'cause I wrote it 10 times or more. It's about to be writ again, as I ask you to vote for some sailors fighting in the dance hall. Oh man, look at those cavemen go. It's the freakiest show. Take a look at the old man beating up the wrong guy. Oh man, wonder if you'll ever know who's in the best-selling show. Is their life on Mars?
Welcome to the Nunkie Arms. Who's in? Gary in the Peak District, Rick in Stockport, John and Emma in Yarm, Jodie in Wolverhampton, Bill in Leicestershire, Paul in Great Grimsby. Just made it in time, Paul. I think I'm right in saying it's your birthday. So happy birthday to Paul. And there's another birthday as well today. So if it's your birthday, let me know in the comments. Hello from Glasgow, Scotland, Indianapolis, terrific. Yeah. Most of these places I will be doing a live performance close to, not Indianapolis, unfortunately, in the coming months in the lead up to Christmas. Behind me, you can see some of the work I've been doing today. I've been preparing these Nunkie commemorative programs, a free copy of which you'll get if you turn up at a live show. I've been going through the Nunkie boxes, making sure all the props are in place, checking that the shirts are in a decent state of cleanliness, and generally getting ready to get back on the road again. So fingers crossed that all works out. So this is the next week. I'll be appearing live for the first time since last October at the Leeds Library, which is a really wonderful, wonderful place. So if you can make it along to that, I'll be doing Casting the Runes by M.R. James. What have we got? Tom Kerr in Newcastle. I'll be in the Lytton Phil in Newcastle at the beginning of November. Leicester, I've got a double gig in Leicester, DU89. Woodstock, Illinois is not gonna make it this time round. There we are, 51 today. Well, many happy returns. Critch, Critch. Emma from Stafford. Richard doesn't say where he's from. Oh, there we are. In Indianapolis. There we are. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't mind coming to Indianapolis. I've been to no, not Indianapolis. But anyway. 63, Paul. Well, congratulations. I'm glad that we have such a wide range of ages watching. So, as I said, I've been preparing for the tour, which kind of begins next week. It's a soft launch next week. It kind of doesn't really start properly till the end of October. But if you go to www.nunkie.co.uk/schedule, you'll find all the dates are now up. Ones in October are in Shrewsbury, Salford, Farsley, and a few others as well. Preston, I think. Oh, also next Tuesday, even before the Leeds gig, I'm doing a reading of a Sherlock Holmes story in a lovely bar in Preston called Plough, Plau. So yeah, come along to that as well. There are lots of tickets left, I believe. Rick in Lincoln. Now, Rick, do you know about what's happening in Lincoln with the drill hall? I heard that it might be reopening. This is one of the theatres that's shut. I don't think it was necessarily because of the lockdown, but during the lockdown. God, they're in March 2020 at Leeds Library, yeah. That must have been one of the last ones I did, yeah. Sorry. But anyway, despite all the live stuff happening, online things will continue of a kind. I'll probably do another edition of the Nunkie Arms sometime in October before I kind of get on the road properly. I think it's the 23rd of October or the 24th, I'm doing a live streamed reading of The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, I'm doing this then because the week after is actually the 40th anniversary of the role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, since it was released. And I used to play it when I was a teenager, and it must have been shortly after it came out. I hadn't realised that at the time, but in the 1980s, I was an enthusiastic player of Call of Cthulhu. Yes, it has. There we are. Excellent. The drill hall has been saved from closure. Terrific news. Well, I hope to be back there at some point. Hey, Bruce in Bedford. I'm in Bedford beginning of December. So Call of Cthulhu, H.P. Lovecraft's story. I've kind of adapted it, and we'll be doing a live rehearsed reading of that online on this medium. It's one of the ones that you have to register for and make a donation, however. So if you go to the website, you'll find a link to the Eventbrite page where you can register for that. Then on Christmas Eve, a long way ahead, I'm going to be doing a ghost story for Christmas, number 13 by M.R. James, at 7 p.m. on Christmas Eve. So that'll be a kind of very nice way to get yourself into the festivities, and you'll still be able to watch the Mark Gatiss adaptation of the Metzgertin, which is probably on later that night. Anyway, there we are. So yeah, fingers crossed, lots happening, and certainly those online things will be happening. But tonight, in Call of Cthulhu, you have a thing called sanity points, and it's been such a long time since I played. But I had a character called Dooley Dugard Peach, who was supposed to be a distant relative of the writer of the Ladybird history books. And I can't really remember. Oh, well, I remember there was one excellent scenario we played set in Suffolk in the village of Walberswick, which had very much an M.R. James vibe to it. Yeah, well, Richard, I think you're right. I think I've adapted it quite a lot, but see what you think. It will be a bit of an ask. Anyway, tonight we're back in the Nunkie Arms. I'm drinking wine tonight. I feel like I kind of been a little bit bloated recently. I'm trying to kind of not fill myself too much with things. Now, well, I'll tell you, you put Fatagan or Fatag, one of the most difficult things about Call of Cthulhu is the pronunciation of the Cthulhuid language that he invents. I have experts who I'm able to consult on that, however. A game. Yeah, well, I wonder. Yeah, I think you can play online Call of Cthulhu. In fact, I'm sure you can. Anyway, tonight's the Nunkie Arms. It's a favourite I'm going to read tonight. It's actually a repeat. You might have heard it before, right at the beginning of lockdown, and I've also done it live a few times. It's a favourite story by a favourite writer. The writer is H.G. Wells, who really is one of the great writers of imaginative short stories. And in the 1890s, he wrote dozens of really terrific scientific romances, he called them. They're kind of the early science fiction, along the lines of his novels like The Time Machine and The Invisible Man and War of the Worlds. And the one I'm going to read tonight, I think it works as a kind of a prequel to War of the Worlds. I've certainly tweaked it. I've adapted it slightly and tweaked it to make it kind of more of a kind of anticipation of the disaster that happens in War of the Worlds. And it's called The Crystal Egg. Emma Reese has got a hot tub. Gosh. So The Crystal Egg by H.G. Wells. There was, until a year ago, a very grimy looking little shop near Seven Dials in Covent Garden, over which, in weather-worn yellow lettering, was inscribed the legend, Cornelius Cave, naturalist and dealer in antiquities. Now, such emporia do still exist here and there. They deal in the detritus of another age, and from another age they themselves come. Now, I'm personally very fond of shops like that, and I knew this particular one rather well. The contents of Mr. Cave's shop window were delightfully variegated. They comprised an uneven number of elephant tusks and a box of glass eyes, an incomplete set of soapstone chessmen, an extraordinary dirty glass fish tank, a fly-blown ostrich egg or two, several butterfly nets, and 3 moth-eaten stuffed monkeys, one of which is brandishing a shillelagh. There was also, at the time that I would like to concentrate on now, a mass of brilliantly polished crystal worked into the shape of an egg, which was being closely examined by 2 gentlemen who stood outside the window looking in. One of them was a tall, thin, middle-aged man, a clergyman. The other was a tiny fellow, almost a midget, I think you'd say, young, with a dusky complexion and a wispy black beard. Now, Mr. Cave himself now entered the shop from the door behind the counter, and when he saw this pair and the object of their regard, his pale face, which was lugubrious at the best of times, fell further, and he glanced anxiously over his shoulder and shut the door behind him. He winced as he saw the clergyman delve into his trouser pocket, pull out a handful of money, and smile at his companion. And he sighed heavily as the 2 men opened the front door and came into the shop. "Aha! Good day," said the clergyman amiably. "I wondered, the crystal... Well, what is it exactly? Egg, I suppose you'd say, wouldn't you? The one in the window there. How much is it?" £5, said Mr. Cave abruptly. And again he glanced nervously towards the door behind the counter. £5? Oh, no. My good man, surely not so much as that. Here, how about we say... And an attempt at bargaining was then begun. But Mr. Cave stepped over to the shop door, held it open and said, £5 is my price. No haggling here. As he spoke, the upper portion of a woman's face appeared in the glass panel of the door leading to the parlour and peered out at the 2 customers. £5, said Mr. Cave again, with a notable quiver in his voice this time. The crystal cost £5. Well, the small young man, who so far had remained a spectator, now spoke. "Give him £5, James." "What? Really?" said the clergyman. "That seems an awful lot to me." But all right, he muttered grumpily as he counted the money in his pocket. Now, this gave Mr. Cave an opportunity to collect his thoughts, and he began to explain in an agitated manner that he had in fact made a mistake and that the crystal was not for sale after all, although that is a probable purchaser of it had already appeared that morning. And well, of course, he was very sorry to disappoint the two gentlemen, but they understood, of course, that promises were promises. Well, the two men were about to leave the shop in some dudgeon when the door behind the counter opened and a stout, coarse-featured woman with little dark eyes bustled through it. "What's going on?" she demanded. "Yeah, nothing, Mary, thank you. I can handle this." "Nothing, nothing? That crystal is for sale and £5 is a very good price for it. What do you mean not to take this gentleman's offer?" "Please, Mary, I know my business." "Oh, do you now? I wonder sometimes, I really do." And so began a lively altercation, which the two customers watched with some amusement, occasionally offering suggestions to the lady, whom they soon gathered was Mrs. Cave. Now, hard driven as he was, her husband nevertheless persisted in his impossible story of another offer for the crystal having been made that same morning, and painful as his agitation became, he nevertheless stuck to his point with extraordinary tenacity. It was the dark-skinned young man who broke the stalemate. He proposed that they should call again in 2 days' time to give the alleged purchaser a fair chance to collect and pay for his wares. But then, he said, we must insist. "Yep, £5, added the clergyman, wagging a finger at the unhappy couple as he left. Well, the row between the Caves continued long after closing time and eventually drove Mr. Cave from a half-eaten supper back into the shop, his ears aflame and tears of vexation and self-reproach stinging his eyes. Oh, God, what an oaf he was! What an infernal oaf! Why had he left the crystal in the shop window for so long? God, what an oaf! He stayed up late that night, ostensibly to make ornamental rookeries for goldfish cases, but really for a private purpose that will be better explained later. The next morning, Mrs. Cave found that the crystal had been removed from the window and was lying behind some second-hand books on angling. She replaced it in a conspicuous position. In the afternoon, when his wife was taking her usual nap, Mr. Cave removed it again, and in the early evening she once more found it and put it back, and so the day passed disagreeably. The following morning, Mr. Cave had to deliver a consignment of dogfish for dissection at one of the hospital schools, and in his absence his wife's mind reverted to thoughts of the crystal and the methods of expenditure suitable to a windfall of £5. She'd already devised several rather agreeable expedients: a dress of green silk for herself, a pair of mauve slippers, and her eye naturally turned to the window for a sight of the assurance of these dreams. What then was her anger and dismay to discover that the crystal egg had once more disappeared. When Mr. Cave returned from his business with the dogfish that afternoon to find his wife on her knees behind the counter, rooting among his taxidermic material. Her face came up hot and wrathful over the counter as the bell announced his return. "Where have you hidden it, Cave?" "Hidden what?" "Don't you hidden what, me? Where is it? That crystal egg or ball or whatever it is." At which Mr. Cave rushed to the shop window and expressed great anguish and surprise at the object's absence. Now, his wife was not taken in, of course, and so began another acrimonious and emotional discussion, which ended for Mrs. Cave in a peculiarly nervous condition midway between hysterics and amuck. The next morning, the clergyman and his friend called again and were received by a tearful Mrs. Cave. It transpired that no one could imagine all that she had stood from her husband at various times in her married pilgrimage, and she gave a garbled account of the crystal's disappearance. Although the two customers laughed silently at one another, said that it was very extraordinary, and made to leave, whereupon Mrs. Cave, still clinging to some hope, asked for the clergyman's address so that if she could get anything out of her husband, she might communicate it. Now, for some time, matters were very badly strained in the Cave household, but the crystal did not reappear. Now, without mincing the matter, I can confirm that Mr. Cave was a liar. He knew perfectly well where the crystal was. It was in the rooms of Mr. Jacoby Wace, assistant demonstrator at St. Catherine's Hospital, Westbourne Street, London, W2. It stood on a sideboard, partially covered by a black velvet cloth beside a decanter of American whiskey. How do I know this? Because I am Mr. Jacoby Wace. Now, you see, Cave had brought it to the hospital hidden in the dogfish sack and had pressed me to take it for him. I admit that I was dubious at first. My relationship to Cave was a peculiar one. I mean, I have, I suppose, a taste for what you'd call characters, and I had more than once invited this funny old man to smoke and drink with me in my rooms. You know, I'd been amused to listen to his views on life in general and on his wife in particular. I'd also encountered Mrs. Cave on occasions when her husband was not at home to attend to me in the shop, and I knew the constant interference to which she subjected him. So, having weighed the matter judicially, I decided that I would give his crystal a refuge. Now, Mr. Cave explains his remarkable affection for it. He said that he would describe it more fully on a later occasion. But even then, he spoke openly of seeing visions within it. He called on me the following evening, and the story that he told was a complicated one. The crystal, Mr. Cave said, had come into his possession with other oddments at the forced sale of a fellow curiosity dealer's effects. Now, not knowing its worth, he'd valued it at 10 shillings, and it had hung around the shop unsold for several months. He was just thinking of reducing the price when he made a singular discovery. Now, at the time, his health was very bad. In fact, it must be borne in mind that throughout this entire experience, Mr. Cave's physical condition was one of ebb. But he'd also suffered, he explained, for weeks at a time sometimes, from melancholia and insomnia. Now, on such occasions of late, he'd taken to slipping from his wife's side when his thoughts became intolerable and wandering about the house. And at about 3 o'clock one morning, late in August, chance directed him into the shop. The dirty little place was impenetrably black at that time of night, except in one spot where he perceived an unusual glow. Approaching this, he discovered the source of the glow to be the crystal egg, which was standing on the corner of the counter towards the window. A thin ray of moonlight was creeping through a crack in the shutters. It impinged upon the subject, and it seemed, as it were, to fill its interior. Now, it occurred to Mr. Cave immediately that this was not in accordance with the laws of optics as he had known them in his younger days. I mean, he could understand rays being refracted and coming to focus in the crystal's interior, but this diffusion of light jarred with his physical conceptions. He approached the object cautiously, peering around and into it, and he was taken aback to find that the light within it was not steady. Rather, it was writhing within the substance of the egg, as though it were a hollow sphere of some luminous vapor. And in moving about to get a closer, different point of view, he found that even when he came between it and the source of light, the crystal nonetheless remained luminous. Well, greatly astonished, he lifted it out of the light ray and carried it to the darkest part of the shop, where it remained bright for some 4 or 5 minutes before slowly fading and going out. And when he placed it back in the streak of light, its luminosity was immediately restored. Now, thus far, at least, I was able to verify Mr. Cave's claims. I mean, I have myself repeatedly held this very crystal in a thin ray of light and in a perfect darkness, such as could be produced by a velvet wrapping, the crystal did undoubtedly appear very faintly to my eyes phosphorescent. It would seem, however, that this luminosity was not equally visible to all eyes. My own capacity was considerably inferior to that of Mr. Cave's, and even with Cave himself, the power varied considerably. It seems that his vision was, in fact, most vivid during states of extreme weakness and fatigue. Well, from the outset, the light in the crystal had exercised a curious fascination upon my strange friend, and I fear that it says much about his loneliness of soul that he told no other human being about his observations. He found that as the dawn advanced and the amount of diffused light increased, the crystal became to all appearances non-luminous, and for some time he was unable to see anything in it except at night in the darkest corners of the shop. But the use of an old velvet cloth, which he had used as a background for a collection of stuffed toads, occurred to him, and by doubling this and putting it over his head, he was able to observe the luminous movement within the crystal even in the brightest day. And one day, as he looked, he saw something. Now, it came and went in a flash, but he had the impression that the crystal egg had for a moment opened to him the view of a strange and spacious country. And turning it about, he saw, just as the light faded, the same vision again. Now, it would be tedious for me to detail every phase of Mr. Cave's discovery from this point. Let it suffice to say, the effect was this. The crystal, being peered at an angle of 137 degrees from the direction of the illuminating ray, gave a clear and consistent picture of a wide and peculiar landscape. Now, it was not dreamlike. It produced a definite impression of reality, and the better the light, the more real and solid it seemed. It was a moving picture, that is to say, certain objects moved within it, but very slowly, in an orderly manner. I mean, that they moved like real things. And according as the direction of the lighting and vision changed, the picture changed also. Now, Mr. Cave's statements were extremely detailed. You've got to believe me about this. And they were, I can assure you, entirely free from that emotional quality that taints hallucinatory impressions. But it must be remembered also that all my own efforts to see anything clear in the faint opalescence of the crystal were wholly unsuccessful. I mean, try as I might, the impressions that Mr. Cave and I got were simply of a different intensity, and it seems that what I saw as a mere blurred nebulosity was for Mr. Cave a definite view, a landscape. This view, as Mr. Cave described it, was invariably of an extensive plain, and he seemed always to be looking at it from a considerable height. To the east and west, the plain was bounded at a remote distance by vast reddish cliffs, which receded in an almost illimitable perspective and faded into the mist of the distance before they met. He was nearer to the eastern set of cliffs. On the occasion of his first vision, he saw the sun rising behind them, and black against the sunlight and pale against their shadow appeared a multitude of soaring forms, which Mr. Cave immediately described as birds. A vast range of buildings spread below him. There were curiously shaped trees too, he said, growing beside a wide and shining canal. And every so often, something vast and brilliantly coloured flew across the picture. Now, the first time that Mr. Cave saw these images, he he saw only in flashes. I mean, his hand shook, his head moved, the vision came and went and grew foggy and indistinct. And at first he had the greatest difficulty in finding the picture again once the direction of it had been lost. His next clear vision, however, which came about a week after the first, showed him the view down the length of the valley. It was evening now, and the view was different, but Cave had a curious persuasion, which subsequent observations confirmed, that he was regarding this strange world from exactly the same spot, though looking from a different direction. The long facade of the great building, whose roof that he'd looked down upon before, now receded in perspective, but he recognized the roof. It was the same roof. In front of this facade was a long terrace, and down the middle of this, at certain intervals, stood huge but very graceful masts, at the top of which were small shining objects which reflected the setting sun. Now, the import of these did not occur to us until much later. The terrace overhung a thicket of luxuriant and graceful vegetation, and beyond this was a wide grassy lawn on which certain creatures reposed. That they were, said Mr. Cave, like beetles, but enormously larger. Now, beyond this again was a richly decorated causeway of pinkish stone, and beyond that, lined with dense red weeds, and passing up the valley, exactly parallel with the distant cliffs, was this broad and mirror-like expanse of water. The air, said Mr. Cave, seemed to be full of squadrons of these great birds. He described them manoeuvring in stately curves. And across the river was a multitude of splendid buildings, richly coloured and glittering with metallic tracery among a forest of mossy lichenous trees. Something suddenly flapped across Mr. Cave's view, like the fluttering of a jewelled fan, he said, and a face, or rather the upper part of a face with very large eyes, came close to his own, as if on the other side of the crystal. Now, Mr. Cave was so startled and impressed by the absolute reality of those eyes that he drew his head back from the crystal to look behind it. You know, he'd become so absorbed in watching that he was quite surprised to find himself in the murky darkness of his own little shop. And as he blinked about him, the glowing crystal faded and went out. Such were the first general impressions of Mr. Cave. I find that my glass is empty, and it seems to be a good place to take a comfort break. So yes, I'm just going to take a comfort break. There'll be a bit of dead time, but I think I'll just carry on with the same broadcast rather than start another one when I get back. So yes, make yourselves comfortable for a while. I'll be back. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright and sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by a woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if the earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momentarily was forced, amid whose swift, half-intermitted burst, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail, and midst these dancing rocks, at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with amazing motion through wood and dale, the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I'd build that pleasure dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes in holy dread. For he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. Sorry about that. That was a bit longer than I meant. I decided to eat a few olives. So what do you think? Yeah, the crystal egg. Yeah. I don't know. Well, let's see. We're only halfway through. So, yes, where we were previously on the crystal egg, Mr. Cave, the owner of a shop of curiosities in Covent Garden, has started seeing visions through the medium of a crystal egg. He's seeing a landscape, an unfamiliar alien landscape. And he's taken the egg to a scientist, Mr. Jacoby Wace, who would help him interpret these visions, and also to kind of look after the egg because his wife wants to sell it. So from the outset, Mr. Cave explained to me his imagination was strangely affected by what he saw within the crystal. And as he began to appreciate the details of the scene, his interest and wonder swelled into a passion. You know, he went about his daily business listless and distraught, thinking only of the time when he would be able to return to the crystal egg. Then, a few weeks after his first sighting of this curious valley, came the two customers to the shop, the stress and excitement of their trying to buy the egg, and that narrow escape of it actually being sold. Now, while the thing was Mr. Cave's secret, it remained a mere wonder, a thing to creep to covertly and to peep at as a child might peep upon a forbidden garden. Well, you see, I suppose that, well, I am a scientist, and I have a rather more lucid and consecutive habit of mind than Mr. Cave. And directly that the crystal and its story came to my notice, I proceeded to develop the matter more systematically. Mr. Cave, he was only too eager to visit my rooms to feast his eyes on this wonderland. He came every night, in fact, from 8:30 until 10:30. Sometimes even in my absence, he came during the day. He also came on Sunday afternoons. Now, from the outset, I made copious notes, and I don't think it's boastful to assert that it was due to my scientific method that the relation between the direction from which the initiating ray entered the crystal and the orientation of the picture was proved, which meant that in a short while we were able to survey this valley in any direction which we desired. So, having cleared up this, allow me, I'll give a more detailed account of the world that was seen within the crystal. Now, the things that I'm going to describe are in all cases seen by Mr. Cave alone. The method of working was invariably for him to watch the crystal and report what he said while I took notes. As a science student, I've long perfected the trick of writing in the dark. Now, when the crystal faded, it was put into its box in its proper position, the electric light was turned on, and I then had the opportunity to ask further questions, and I could suggest observations to clear up any ambiguous points. In fact, nothing could really have been less visionary and more matter of fact. So, within the egg, Mr. Cave's attention had been immediately attracted, of course, by these bird-like creatures that he'd seen in each of his earlier visions. Now, his first impression was soon corrected, however, because they clearly weren't birds at all. He considered for a time that they might represent a species of diurnal bat. He then thought, grotesquely enough, that they might be cherubim. I mean, their heads were round and curiously human, and it was the eyes of one of them that had so startled him on his second observation. They had broad, silvery wings, but they weren't feathered, however. They were glistening, or almost like newly killed fish, and with the same subtle play of colour. And the wings, they weren't built on the plan of a bird wing, but they were supported instead by curved ribs that radiated from the body. I suppose a sort of a butterfly wing supported by curved ribs seems to be the best way of describing them. The body of the creature was small, but it was fitted with two bunches of prehensile organs. They were like long tentacles almost under the mouth. And incredible as it may sound, the persuasion became at last irresistible that it was these creatures which owned the great quasi-human buildings and the magnificent garden that made this valley so splendid to look at. I mean, Mr. Cave noticed, you see, that these buildings had, among other peculiarities, no doors, and that the creatures made entrances and exits through these great circular windows close to the top. You know, that they'd alight upon their tentacles, fold their wings in an almost rod-like smallness, and then they'd hop into the interior. Among them was a multitude of smaller winged creatures. Mr. Cave said they were like huge dragonflies, and on the causeways and terraces there were similar creatures, but they were wingless this time and with much bigger heads. These hopped about on the kind of the hand-like tentacles beneath their mouths. Now, I've already mentioned the glittering objects on the masts that stood on the terrace of the nearer building. Well, it occurred to Mr. Cave, after regarding one of these masts very fixedly on one particularly vivid day, that the glittering object on top of it was, in fact, a crystal, exactly like the one into which he peered. And a still more careful scrutiny convinced him that each mast in a vista of nearly 20 carried a similar object at its top. Now, occasionally, one of the large flying creatures would flutter up to one of these and, coiling its tentacles about the mast, would regard the crystal for a time. Sometimes it was as long as 15 minutes. And a series of observations, which were made at my suggestion, convinced us that the crystal into which we were peering actually stood at the summit of the endmost mast on the terrace, and that on one occasion at least, an inhabitant of this other world had looked directly into Mr. Cave's face while he was making his observations. All right, well, so much for the facts of this story. And yes, of course, yeah, you could easily dismiss it as a fabrication, an elaborate hoax dreamt up by a sick and lonely old man. But you see, I cannot do that. I've seen too much. And I cannot but believe, well, all right, one of two things. Either that Mr. Cave's crystal was in two worlds at once, and that while it was carried about in one, it remained stationary in the other, which seems altogether absurd, or else that it had some peculiar relation of sympathy with another and exactly similar crystal in this other world, so that what was seen in the interior of the one on this world was, under suitable conditions, visible to an observer in the corresponding crystal in another world, and vice versa, of course. All right, yes, I realize that at present we do not know of any way in which two crystals could come en rapport in this way, but we do perhaps know enough to accept that it is not altogether impossible. No? You know, this view of crystals being en rapport, for want of a better phrase, is, I think, at the very least plausible. But where was this other world, you ask? Well, I believe that here I can also shed some light. After sunset, you see, the sky darkened rapidly, and the stars shone very brightly, and they were recognizably the same stars as those that we see in our night sky. They were arranged in the same constellations. Mr. Cave could recognize the Pleiades, the Bear, Sirius. Now, following up on this clue, I learned from Cave that the midnight sky was a darker blue even than our midwinter sky, that the sun seemed a little smaller, and crucially, that there were two small moons. They were like our moon, said Mr. Cave, but much smaller and quite differently marked. Now, one of these moons moved so rapidly, he said, that its motion was clearly visible as one regarded it. And they were never high in the sky, these moons, but they vanished almost as soon as they rose. I mean, that is, every time that they revolved, they were eclipsed because they were so near their primary planet. And all of these clues answer completely, as I'm sure you yourselves realize, although Mr. Cave himself did not, to what must be the condition of things on Mars. Mars. In fact, it seems to me extremely plausible to draw the conclusion that when Mr. Cave peered into this crystal, he was looking at Mars and its inhabitants. And if that is the case, then the evening star that shone so brilliantly in the sky of that distant vision was nothing more or less than us. It was the Earth. Now, during this time, the Martians, if indeed, let's call them Martians, they do not seem to have been aware of Mr. Cave's observation of them. I mean, once or twice, one of them would come to peer from its side of the crystal, but it would always go very, very shortly to some other mast, as though the vision that it saw was unsatisfactory. And so during this time, he was able to observe the proceedings of this world undisturbed. Now, it's true that his reports are vague and fragmentary. He was never able to ascertain, for instance, if the winged Martians were the same as the Martians who hopped around on the causeways and the terraces, and if the latter could put on wings at will. But I mean, it's understandable. I mean, imagine for a moment that the complete impression of humanity a Martian observer would get, who, after a difficult period of preparation and with considerable fatigue to the eyes, was able to peer at London only from the steeple of St. Martin's Church for stretches at longest of 4 minutes of a time. The vagueness of these impressions is, I think, quite understandable. Now, several times, Cave saw certain clumsy bipeds, dimly suggestive, he said, of apes, white and partially translucent, that they were feeding among these lichenous trees in the distance. And once he watched as some of these fled before one of the hopping round-headed Martians. The latter caught one in its tentacles, and then the picture suddenly faded, leaving Mr. Cave most tantalizingly in the dark, but in fact, I think probably rather relieved that he'd not seen the conclusion of this attack. On another occasion, a vast thing that Mr. Cave at first thought was a gigantic insect appeared, advancing along the causeway beside the canal with extraordinary rapidity. And as it drew nearer, Mr. Cave realized with a shock that it wasn't an insect, that it was a vast machine. It was a mechanism with a almost lifelike movement, or made of shining metals of extraordinary complexity. I mean, when he looked again at this, it had quite passed out of sight. And I do remember clearly, he seemed oddly disturbed by that particular vision. Well, these observations that we shared took us until early November. And then Mr. Cave, feeling that the suspicions of his wife were allayed, began to take the crystal to and fro with him to his house and to my rooms. So he wanted to comfort himself more readily with what was fast becoming the most real thing in his existence. In December, my own work in connection with the forthcoming examination became heavy, and for 11 days I saw nothing of my friend. But you see, then I grew anxious to resume our investigations, and the stress of my seasonal labours being abated, I went down to 7 dials to visit his shop. At the corner of the street, I noticed a shutter before a bird fancier's window, and then another at a cobbler's. Mr. Cave's own shop was shut. Well, I rapped on the door, and eventually it was opened by Mrs. Cave, who was, I could not but observe, all dressed in black. She'd just returned from Highgate, she said. She'd been crying, and her voice was a little thick. And without any very great surprise, I learned that Mr. Cave was dead and already buried. His wife's mind seemed to be occupied with her own prospect, of course, but I was able to learn some of the particulars of Mr. Cave's passing. He had apparently been found dead in his shop in the early morning, the day after his last visit to me, and the crystal egg had been clasped in his stone-cold hands. Mrs. Cave herself had discovered the body. She couldn't find the words to describe the expression on her dead husband's face, but it made me feel so very, very sorry for him, she said. And she started weeping again. The doctor told her that he must have been dead for 5 or 6 hours. Well, yes, of course. This was a shock to me, of course, and I reproached myself bitterly for having ignored the old man's obvious ill health. But there's no point in denying that I admit that my chief thought was for the crystal egg. I approached the topic gingerly because I knew Mrs. Cave's peculiarities, and I was absolutely dumbfounded to learn that it had already been sold. Mrs. Cave's first impulse, directly her husband's body had been taken upstairs, had been, of course, to write to the clergyman who'd offered £5 for the crystal, informing him of its discovery. But after a violent hunt, she could not find his address anywhere. And as she was without the means required to mourn and bury Mr. Cave in the style that the dignity of an old Seven Dials resident inhabitant demands, she'd appealed to a friendly fellow tradesman in Great Portland Street. He had very kindly taken over a portion of the stock at a valuation. The valuation, of course, had been his own, and the crystal egg was included in one of those lots. All right, well, after a few suitable, if rather hurried condolences, I made my way to Great Portland Street, where I learnt that the crystal egg had already been sold to a tall, dark man in a grey suit. And I'm afraid that is where the material facts of this story come to an abrupt end. The Great Portland Street dealer did not know who the tall, dark man in the grey suit was, nor had he observed him with sufficient attention to describe him in any more detail. He couldn't say how tall he was, or whether he wore a beard. He did not, in fact, seem to have any recollection of his face at all, which I found peculiar. And for a time, I remained in his shop, trying his patience with my hopeless questions. And then at last, realizing that the whole thing had passed out of my hands, I returned to my rooms, a little astonished to find the notes that I'd made still tangible and visible on my writing table. I leave it to you to imagine my frustration and disappointment. Now, a few days later, I made a second call upon the Great Portland Street dealer, equally ineffectual, and I took out advertisements in certain periodicals which I thought likely to come into the hands of a collector of bric-a-brac. I wrote letters to the Daily Chronicle and to Nature too, but the editors of both of those journals asked me to reconsider before they printed. I was advised, rather sternly actually, that such a strange story, so bare of supporting evidence, might imperil my own reputation as a scientific advisor. And anyway, whether they were right or not, the calls of my other work were pressing. And so, after a month or so, save for an occasional reminder to certain dealers, and with the intensest reluctance, I abandoned the quest. I mean, of course, I still have regular bursts of zeal, and I resumed the search. But from that day to this, the crystal egg remains undiscovered. And whether or not it will remain forever lost with the material and the origin of it, who knows? I mean, if the tall grey man with a blank face is a collector, then one would have expected surely he'd seen my inquiries, or he'd have heard something through the dealers. I was incidentally able to discover the identities of the clergyman and his tiny friend. In fact, they were none other than the Reverend James Parker and the young Prince of Bosokuni in Java, and I am obliged to them for certain particulars. The object, the prince said, was simply curiosity on his part and extravagance, he said. And I've no reason to disbelieve him. He said that he was eager to buy simply because Cave had seemed so oddly reluctant to sell. Now, it's just possible, I suppose, that the tall man was simply a casual purchaser as well. And then the crystal egg, for all I know, may at this very moment be within a mile or two of my house, decorating a drawing room or serving as a paperweight on a desk. And in fact, it's partly with the idea of that possibility that I have agreed to speak with you tonight. Please do pass on any information or theories that you may have. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this, because I believe, I have no option but to believe, that the crystal on the mast in Mars and the crystal egg of Mr. Caves are in some physical, but all right, at the moment, quite inexplicable way, en rapport. I mean, no theory of hallucination suffices for the facts that I've observed. And I further believe this, that the terrestrial crystal must have been, possibly at some very remote date, sent hither from that planet in order to give the Martians a clear view of our affairs. I mean, possibly the fellows to the crystals on the other masts are also dotted around our globe. And if that is the case, the question that haunts me is not so much how was this done, but why? I mean, why should they do that? Why? I thank you for your time. Da 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 da. John Dogwater, the first mention of the Men in Black phenomena. To be honest, I think I tweaked it a bit to give that impression. Yeah. There we are. The sequel to that is War of the Worlds. So there we are. It's a good story. It doesn't. I'm not sure it works quite as a thing to read aloud or to hear, but I think it's a great story. The best occasion on which I read that story was I did a reading like that in the dome of the Great Equatorial Telescope in Greenwich, of Greenwich Mean Time fame. And the old Victorian telescope has this dome, and you could fit about 20 people in there, and kind of in front of the framework that held this massive telescope. I did that story. Yeah, there we are. Envious eyes. Yeah, yeah. It was written just before. Well, it was written at the time that War of the Worlds was being serialized. So it was written before the novel was published. But it's clearly part of his thinking about life on Mars. And in fact, he wrote about the same time he wrote a weird article for a magazine called Cosmopolitan. Now, it wasn't Cosmopolitan as we know it now, but it was a magazine from the time called Cosmopolitan, which is a serious article, a kind of non-fiction article about the possibility of life on Mars. And there's some absolutely brilliant illustrations. I'll put them up on my Facebook page later tonight or tomorrow. And this was at a time when the speculations about life on Mars were rife and serious. There's not sure this published anything, but the first time I did this was in the Whipple Museum of the History of Science in Cambridge, and one of the curators there, called Josh Nall, this was his interest, the mapping of Mars and the speculations about Mars in the 19th century. And I'm not sure they haven't written a book about it, or certainly published some kind of things. But yeah, it was very interesting. The real belief that and speculation about what was on Mars because of the Martian canals. Let's see, we've got some more. Yeah, Jeff Wayne. Yeah, it is great music. A small hot tub is still a hot tub. You can't have, degrees of hot tub privilege. You've either got one or you haven't. Enjoy it, Hey, hang on. Penny mentions an immersive War of the Worlds experience in London. No. Where? Well, if you went a couple of years ago, I'm sure does it still exist? Penny asks, has anyone else been to the War of the Worlds? I'd love to. I'd not heard of it. I'd love to know about it. I remember there used to be an Alien, the film Alien experience in I think it was in the Trocadero. It's in the middle of London, and I was once auditioned to be an alien in it because they needed tall men, and I can't remember why I didn't get the part. I think I didn't get it because I was too tall. Yeah, en rapport. It's interesting, isn't it? Particularly as I'm speaking to you through this object now. But en rapport, I don't know. Yes, I don't know whether he developed that idea or what it came from. There's a fantastic story which I would like to do sometime, which kind of got quite a bit of attention at the beginning of lockdown when everyone was doing Zoom, by E.M. Forster, called "The Machine Stops," and it's about a kind of terrible future society where everyone lives in pods of their own and they can only communicate through screens and cameras like this. Oh, okay. Richard Williams mentions The Challenge from Beyond. Oh, that does sound good. I like the sound of that. The not very good BBC War of the Worlds was filmed not far from where I am now. Part of it was filmed in Formby Pine Woods, I think. But it was poor, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Maybe not. Yeah, if you enjoyed it, let me know. I didn't watch the whole thing. I watched one episode, and it just had that kind of kind of deathly correctness of collars and, BBC period detail. It just kind of, it was poor. Yeah. If you go to Woking, they've got a tripod, a sculpture of a massive full-size tripod in the town centre. It's kind of, it's very much worth seeing. Oh, there we are. They're selling tickets for Immersive War of the Worlds. Well, let's all go, hey? Let's have a Nunkie Arms trip to the Immersive War of the Worlds. Yeah. But the Woking sculptures, it's brilliant. Like I say, it's brilliant. It's a realistic kind of tripod. Gosh. So listen, Penny, tell us, Penny, who's been to the War of the Worlds immersive show, what happens? Do you kind of run? Are you running away from tripods and so on, or because in this Alien one, it was good. It was like a kind of it's a bit like a kind of haunted house that they have in America. You're kind of led along by a Marine, and occasionally an alien would leap out at you. And it was, I was given a kind of free run of it as part of my audition, and it was really frightening. And that was kind of probably 12 people in each one. So what else is going on? Who's coming to who's booked their tickets for a Nunkie show? Shall I read you the? Yeah, where are we? Oh yeah, I'll read you the Oh no, I don't want to. Alien War, that's what it was. Yeah, it was really scary. Yeah. So, the Cambridge United. There we are. So, yeah, I'm doing the whole of Ghost Stories and Antiquary, all 8 stories over 2 nights in Cambridge, and I'll also be doing it in Manchester and London in the new year. So keep an eye out for that. Like an escape room. Yeah. Now, there may not be complete agreement about this, but the BBC one, the period drama that they did, wasn't very good. I do like the Tom Cruise film of War of the Worlds. I think that does a good job of it, particularly the bit where in the novel, he's the narrator finds himself stuck with this dreadful, cowardly clergyman, kind of in a basement or in a bunker. And that's very well, that kind of the equivalent of that scene in the Tom Cruise film is very well done. Hulton le Clay? Paul, never heard of it. Hooray. Sebastian asks, will I ever do Nottingham? Well, I don't know. I never have, and I don't even know of a venue in Nottingham. I'd be perfectly happy to if I were booked. North Thoresby, that's right, North Thoresby. Anyone from the Preston area want to come to Sherlock Holmes next week? Well, Ben, it sounds to me like the hot tub's only big enough for one person anyway, so maybe when this is over, you can take your turn. John Christopher, Nick asks, anyone remember John Christopher's The Tripods? Nick, I've never heard of it. Is it derived from War of the Worlds? Now Tom mentions the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre in Edinburgh, which is where I'm doing a show in mid-November. Yeah, really worth checking out. It's basically a spiritualist centre rather than a literary centre. So it's kind of it's named after Conan Doyle, not for his writing, but for his work as a spiritualist. But it's a beautiful building in Edinburgh. Really gorgeous building. Oh, there we are. Nick's got lots of tripod friends. Oh, look at this. There we are. No, I'd never heard of this. An Anglo-French War of the Worlds with Gabriel Byrne. That sounds worth checking out. Huh. Dagon War of the Worlds. Wow. God, I will look at the tripods. I've never heard of it. Rick, what's the story with the... no. Okay. Oh, well, I will look at the I'll make a note to look up the tripods. Yeah, is anyone familiar with the E.M. Forster story I mentioned before, the machine stops? Sorry, I don't want to interrupt the tripod's loving. Everyone knows it. No, it's all right. No, yeah, sure, it's great, the tripods. Yes, the machine stops. There we are. I think someone did it on stage quite recently, but it's a very I'm surprised I kind of it's not been adapted into film. It'd be very easy to film. I'm surprised no one made a film during lockdown, because you could do it with this technology. Hawkwind made an album based on what, Gary? On the machine stops or on tripods? So Penny, yeah, the machine stops. It's set in a dystopian future where people all live in individual pods, and the world and the outside air is unbreathable, and the world is run by a machine that kind of operates these pods and so on. And you can only communicate to people through a medium like this. But you can also, there are kind of extenuating circumstances in which you can travel. And a son wants to visit his mother, and they live on opposite parts of the world. And then the machine that operates that world, Hawkwind based an album on the machine. How extraordinary. Hawkwind based an album on the Machine Stops. Wow. But there's another story by E.M. Forster, which I'd like to do, called The Story of a Panic. E.M. Forster was younger than, but a contemporary of M.R. James at King's College, Cambridge. And I've not come across any, communication between the two, but they must have known each other or been aware of each other. They must have known each other to an extent. Anyway, The Story of a Panic, published in the same year as Whistle I'll Come to You, My Lad, involves the blowing of a whistle and the coming of a terrible wind, and that's the dissimilarities are more obvious than the similarities, but there's a weird kind of So I'll tell you what, there's my screen is telling me there are 43 people watching at the moment. I reckon there's about a dozen people joining in the banter. So come on, it's just gone up to 44. Come on, there are 30 people not telling me where they are and whether they've seen tripods or not. Oh no. Oh, is Phil of Genesis not so well? 45. There we are. I think people are joining. Yeah, that's it. People are kind of joining late. Oh, 40. It's weird. 43. Jolly sight in Liverpool. Good. The Dean of Canterbury read The Machine Stops on YouTube. Yes. Okay. He also read The Signal Man. He's probably done others as well. Penny. Yes. I'm afraid I've not read Morris, so I don't know. But yeah, M.R. James would have been I think he would have been the dean when Forster was at King's. No. Yeah, well, John Dogwater, he didn't write much spooky stuff, but he didn't write many short stories, but you can get hold of his short stories, and there's some speculative supernatural stuff in there. You wouldn't call them ghost stories, I don't think. There's also some kind of rather cheeky gay porn stories as well. Yeah. Oh, well, I'll read more. I remember the film. Oh, dear. So really, yeah. Julie Charlesworth is from Woking, played on Horsell Common. Ah. Wow. Julie, on Horsell Common, is there any kind of, have they got a kind of playground where you can climb on? Is there a tripod climbing frame and so on? Or they must mark it in some way. Lovecraft-based movies. Well, I've seen a couple. The most recent one, the Color Out of Space, was pretty. I enjoyed that. I thought that was good. I was staying in an Airbnb with the director Richard Stanley at the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival a couple of years ago. Wow, this is so good. Hawkwind. Yeah. Wow. Oh, imagine being a teenager in the 80s on Horsell Common. I have a cowboy hat in the in my man cave. Yeah. Hey, good evening, Mr. Freakmeister. So I think the Chris Legg was done as an immersive show in London. Again, it was a couple of years ago, and it may have been cut short by the pandemic. But it was like done in some tunnels in London, where they created the street upon which Mr. Cave's shop was, and kind of had people playing, passers by, and so on. I will do the cowboy. So I'll read a Western tale sometime. Oh, it's just called the Misty Shots. Shit. Well, look, I've got to say, Hawkwind. I've really no idea about Hawkwind. I have a vague idea that they appear on rather unpleasant T-shirts, but I don't know about them at all. Well, yes, yes. I'm sorry. Yes, well, I'm sorry if he's been blacklisted, and I don't know. I know that he has strongly refuted those allegations, but yeah, it's very, whatever the truth, it's a sad situation. Cowboys versus aliens, yeah. Yeah. Well, look, fellas, it's the traditional 1 hour, 30 minutes into the event. It's traditional for last orders to be rung. So it's still only quite early in the evening. It's only 9:30. You can pop out. Oh, what wine am I drinking? It's a Rioja. Yeah, just a simple Rioja. Well, also, I mean, if you spilt some red in the hot tub, that'd look horrible. Yeah, so the Nunkie Arms will be back, I think, one more time before. Well, no, sorry, more than one more time, but it'll be back in October before the. Well, I don't know. No, unpleasant. I just mean, I don't know. Anyway, Gungshi is in the Eastern Land. Anyway, good night, everyone.